Welcome to Economica. Today's video is about the economy of China. This is China, the second largest economy in the world, the largest in population and the largest economy that has grown the most in recent years. A 40-year-old Chinese man saw 36% of the country's workers, or 277 million people, leave the countryside and leave for the cities. To have an idea, that means a migration from Brazil combined to the United Kingdom. It was the largest migratory movement within a country in history. Since the end of the Roman Empire, China has disputed with India the position of richest country in the world. It was also one of the most technologically advanced. This situation changed with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, which increased the volume of the economy of the industrialized countries in a way never seen before and made them technologically much more advanced than the Chinese. During the Industrial Revolution, China had a population of 450 million people, which represented 40% of the world's population. At the beginning of the 20th century, China was already an unrecognizable country. Economically lagging behind, its industrial production was almost nil. This was evident in the Second Sino-Japanese War that entered the period of the Second World War, when Japan, which is a much smaller country with fewer natural resources, but with an enormous capacity to produce tanks, planes and ships. Japan succeeded on its attacks on China and the Chinese people were subjugated and humiliated. Including the invasion of Nanjing, which was one of the greatest atrocities in human history, where about 300,000 Chinese people died and between 20 and 80,000 women were raped. This type of humiliation bothered the Chinese a lot, which caused an intense desire to industrialize, something like that would never happen again. 4 years after the end of the war, in 1949, Mao Zedong, after a civil war and many internal disputes, established a one-party policy. The People's Republic of China, as we know it today. Mao had a long-term vision and managed China to become a modern socialist power. The first step was to rebuild the country that suffered from very serious and costly wars for 5 decades. China's infrastructure and its specialty for centuries, its agricultural production, were destroyed. The Communist Party then did its 5-year economic plan. This meant a centralized, Soviet-style economy, with all production and resource allocation in the hands of the central administration. China focused on building a heavy industry to start its economic development. The Soviet Union helped China by sending scientists and engineers to assist in Chinese development. Before finishing their 5-year plan, dissatisfaction with the efficiency and flexibility of the decision-making, and the mismatch between industrial and agricultural production, converged Chinese leaders that the Soviet way of dealing with the economy might not be the suitable for China. It did not mean that they would abandon communism or central economic planning, but that the provinces would specialize in industrial production or agricultural production. They decided to adopt what was called the Great Leap Forward. It was an economic plan with great ambitions. The problem with this plan was that it didn't focus on technological advancement, it basically focused on making people work harder. Since by the principles of communism, workers had very similar standards of living, with no incentives for those who produced more. Great politicians of the Communist Party, such as Deng Xiaoping, advocated some form of recognition for workers who were most struggling to encourage increased production. But this idea was stifled for 2 reasons. It went against the principle that everyone is the same, that work is collective, and mainly, the leader of the country was a blood dictator. To be classified as an enemy of the revolution and the working class was considered very serious. Mao Zedong's China was full of attitudes with good intention, but which failed in practice. When Deng Xiaoping, who was once minority in the party, reached the position of leader of China, he began to modernize the country, giving more freedom to workers. This is Shanghai, one of the most modern cities in the world. This city exemplifies what modern China is. The GDP of this city alone is higher than that of countries like Sweden, Norway, and the United Arab Emirates. When we talk about China, the dimensions are really big. Now China's new leader created programs that rewarded the talent and effort of the Chinese people. This modernization also reached companies, where Deng realized that state control was inefficient and returned control of many companies to the private sector. This does not mean that property was private as in traditional capitalist countries. If the companies were poorly managed, or if the upper echelons of these companies were against the regime, the government could take back control of these companies. From 1977, the year the plan began, until 1979, the country's industrial production grew by more than 30%. So the system promoted by Deng Xiaoping became much better accepted. The government of Deng Xiaoping decided to venture into international trade, opening up the economy to both exports and imports, at a time when China was obsessed with the idea of becoming self-sufficient. Again, the idea was difficult to explain to members of the Communist Party. Because they believed that something that was produced with the work of the Chinese people should be kept in China, while something that was done abroad would be harming the Chinese and did not deserve to be paid with their money. But Deng was able to implement his plan to open China's trade abroad, but only in special economic zones, cities that served as laboratories for the new Chinese economic model. This new economic model brought problems for the government. People got rich, very rich. Today China is the second country in the world in number of billionaires, and is very close to the United States. Currently, China can no longer be called a communist, at least its economy. Today there are special economic zones in all regions of the country. Although this does not mean that everyone was equally benefited by this policy. The Chinese economy today is mainly composed of the service and industrial sectors, while agriculture, which had been the triumph of the Chinese economy for centuries, ended up being discredited by the government, which created social tensions and motivated the biggest migratory movement in history. China is becoming increasingly powerful, expanding its influence around the world, and claiming the right to explore areas located in the economic zones of countries in the South China Sea, like Philippines. Not only that, there are disputes with Taiwan, which China considers as a renegade province. There are territorial disputes also in Tibet, in addition to the Hong Kong issue, which poses a serious threat to the Chinese government model, since Hong Kong is one of the richest cities in the world. And a much more liberal policy. The construction of infrastructure projects such as the new Silk Route, which will connect dozens of countries on 3 continents, also shows the size of the Chinese ambition and their willingness to further integrate into global production chains. China will probably claim its historic position as the richest country in the world. The Chinese consider their country's failure in industrialization to be a mere comma in the 5,000-year history of the Chinese people. I hope you enjoyed this video. If it was useful for you, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you next time. Welcome to Economy.